Hey everybody. Hi, how's everybody doing so far today? Good?
Woo-hoo.
I figure we have you guys for about 15 minutes before, the food coma starts to kick in. So we're going to try and keep this as interactive as possible. Both Richie and I love questions, so please do bring them. To give you a bit of context, my name is Keith Ippel. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Spring. We're an organization that helps entrepreneurs to change the world. So we do incubation, acceleration, roundtables, and workshops to help people launch, grow, and thrive, and in doing so, change the world in the way that they've chosen. Good to see some familiar faces in the room. Richie, over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Rich Hungerford. I lead corporate development at Hootsuite, so my role is around our partnerships and M&A and strategy. I also come from a background of being an entrepreneur. I started a company called BrightKit in Vancouver, a tech startup, and we were acquired by Hootsuite about 4 years ago, so I've been at Hootsuite for 4 years. We also like to think of ourselves as Narwhal. That's the new Canadian non-mythical creature, but narwhal, unicorn. I'll try to give my best advice from unicorn. I haven't been at Hootsuite from the early days. Hootsuite's about 10 years old, but I've had experience in startups and then with Hootsuite for the last 4 years. So also excited to get your questions. There's an app, so if you have the app, you can also ask questions and we'll be checking along the way.
So a couple of things. I was fortunate to be one of the first advisors at Hootsuite, so have known the journey for about 9 years now. And then Rich and I actually had an opportunity to work together as Rich was launching his company that then got acquired by Hootsuite. And we're going to actually use that as a starting point. So we've broken this out into 3 sort of topical categories. So one is around that unicorn-like acceleration at early and seed stage. And then the second one is to talk about scaling. And then the third one, given, Richie's experience on both sides of the table, pre and post with Hootsuite, the acquisition side of the conversation. So we'll be looking for questions throughout and really excited to do that. As a starting point, early stage, seed stage, BrightKit was actually another company that was born out of Invoke Media, which was the birthplace of Hootsuite, birthplace of Foodie, and a few other sort of known technology companies here in Vancouver. And one of the things that I think was really poignant for me in the early days as BrightKit started to take off, and I saw very similar things at Hootsuite, was the ability to pull great talent. So for example, the first salesperson at Hootsuite was Stefan. Stefan actually did not come from a sales background per se. He actually came from an event background. And you guys, whoever likes the story, Stefan called Al Gore's camp when The Inconvenient Truth first came out, and that was really popular. And he said, "Hey, I want Al Gore to speak in Victoria." And so his camp was like, "Great, that'll be $250,000 US." And so Stefan said, "Sure," and he signed the contract. Then he needed to sell his way out of the problem, right? And so that was a very interesting example of the type of sort of lateral thinking, creative, problem-solving, turning nothing into something sort of approach. On the other side, Rich, you hired Chris McGuire to become your quote-unquote lead developer. When we were going into that meeting, I remember we were talking about how Chris could be the CTO, but we didn't want to saddle Chris with that burden of let's call you CTO and co-founder day one. I think that was a very important decision for the early days of BrightKit as an analog for Hootsuite. Maybe talk about some of the other important decisions that you had to make early on that allowed for early unicorn growth.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think obviously the team is absolutely critical. Those first few hires, and I don't know how many of you caught the luncheon upstairs. So Ryan, CEO of Hootsuite, and Lori from ACL were just talking about how they actually interviewed the first 75 people that came in the door, and then after that, just the scale just didn't work anymore. So the first hires are so important. And it's not just about hiring people who are like you. It's trying to hire people who are probably the least like you to create really diverse teams and bring in a new set of skill sets. One of the things that we learned really early on was just to identify the buyer. And depending on kind of the route to customer acquisition, we were really obsessed with logo acquisition. Like every day, at the end of the day, we'd say, okay, we got these new logos as customers today. And early on, we thought, agencies. Like the agencies were the perfect buyer for us. We were a digital SaaS company, and we went and tried to sell to agencies. We thought, you go to an agency, agencies have 100 customers. So if you get one agency, you get 100 customers. About 3 to 6 months in, we realized that we just weren't getting agencies as customers. They just weren't the right buyer. They think differently. They think on a project by project basis. They also want to do a lot of things themselves. That's how they make money and make margins. And so making a decision to switch. So really, it was a big switch to say, instead of focusing on agencies, we're going to focus on a new market, new demographic, which was also really risky. We'd built a lot of relationships. And so, we went and switched, and we said, okay, actually, let's try something different, because that was not working. Let's target mid-market B2C brands in second and tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So we started phoning companies that were making $200 to $500 million in revenue, and they were based in Kansas City. For example, we sold to a trampoline company, and that was like one of our first big contracts. And once we identified the right buyer in the right type of company in the right segment, we were able to focus and said, we had one salesperson. So instead of phoning, 200 different companies a day in all these different verticals and segments, we were able to really narrow it in. And once we started getting traction, we were able to double down on that. So hire the next salesperson to go in the next region or vertical that we knew was working.
So maybe as an extension of that, and really love that example because it actually talks about some of the data that you guys were looking at, where you're saying, this is not working, let's pick another path. The data tells us that we should go down this path. And then you said, hey, we're starting to call Kansas City and Toledo and some of these other places. And then talk about the importance of data as the leader of the business early when you're trying to grow quickly.
Yeah, I think the data piece, I always loved, someone gave me this analogy, which is to make data informed decisions. So I think that the data is part of it. It's not the whole picture. And for us having starting from day one, we actually had a pretty robust CRM installation. And that is something that we started early, so we were able to track and run these different, really simple reports. But what was working and what was not working, we did monthly sales reviews. So now we do think a lot about quarterly sales cycles. We were thinking very much on a monthly basis, and that allowed us to pivot and change course really quickly. And so CRM and really tracking these things was critical. And then at the end of the day, it really came down to conversion metrics. And at the time, this was probably 7 years ago, HubSpot was doing an amazing job of publishing all their content. They're really open. They have these amazing blogs, but they were the first to kind of create these industry benchmarks around. If you call this many people, you should have this many second calls and third calls and follow-ups and actual closing of deals. And so we started to really think about metrics in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of in the very early days with Hootsuite, for those who are old like me and remember. That was a joke, by the way. So just you guys. Okay, so the interesting thing is, for about 16 months, Hootsuite was free. It was completely free. There was no paid option. And so as Hootsuite started to say, hey, listen, time to start making some money at this, there was a very clear understanding that in order to actually turn this thing into a raging success, not only did they need to measure the right metrics, but they needed to exceed on all of those metrics. And so one of the cornerstone metrics for Hootsuite early on was a conversion from free to pay. And back in that time frame, the benchmark for the industry was about 2.3, 2.4%. So that was, if you were running a freemium business model, if you converted at 2.3, 2.4%, you were the industry average. And so Hootsuite very deliberately in their pricing strategy and also in their conversion strategy said, how do we exceed that? How do we go 2.6? How do we go 2.8? How do we go 3.0? And it is important for you guys to hear this. For the first 2 years after Hootsuite went to freemium from pure free, they were clipping at more than 3x the industry average, right? So that's how the unicorn company was created. It wasn't about the absolute number. It was about the fact that they knew that they not only needed to measure it, but they needed to exceed it in a significant way and really focus the team and the effort and the strategy and the tactics around that. So kind of leads me to a segue question, and that is around funding. And so in my work at Spring and previously, I've had the good fortune of working with a lot of very successful entrepreneurs in Vancouver. one of the hallmarks of what I will call unicorn-esque companies in Vancouver, and I've seen elsewhere, is the ability to go cross-border for funding. Because it's one thing to talk about metrics and growth, but it's another thing to get it funded. So I know with Hootsuite, cross-border rounds early, with Brightkit, cross-border rounds. Talk about the impact that, a diversity of investors had both with Brightkit and what you've seen in Hootsuite.
So about, I actually remember one time I took Keith as an advisor, and we went down we were going down to Seattle, and we had to get up at, I think about 4:45 the alarm was set, and picked Keith up at 5:30, and we were through the border by 6:30, and we got to beat the rush hour traffic in Seattle. And for that, it was just like, it was a weekly commute, because there just wasn't the same amount of seed money in Vancouver. And as you go up and scale like Hootsuite did, there's just not the same amount of capital. But for us, it was amazing, because if you look at Seattle as a core area, it's 2 hours away, two and a half hours away, and you have some of the biggest companies in the world, the largest technology company, Microsoft, there. So you have this, what I see is probably where Vancouver will be in 20 years, where you have these large companies that then create an ecosystem, and they create these people that have the skill sets and the knowledge to go and run different companies. So for both Brightkit and specifically with Hootsuite, it's a very international group of investors, and those investors provide insights that you get from people who have gone through it before. So there's a handful in Vancouver, but when you go to Seattle or San Francisco, it just multiplies.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I think one of the other things that's interesting is I remember, I still clearly remember that meeting actually that Richard and I went down for. And so I'll give you guys, I'm blessed with a near photographic memory, and so I don't know if Richard's going to remember this, but we were in a room full of investors, and there was Richard and I, and I was acting as a surrogate for some of the local investors in Vancouver who were involved in Brightkit. And so Bob Senoff, who's an angel investor in Seattle, he looked at Richard and he said, "So Richard, I need to ask you a question." And Richard was like, "Great." And so Bob asked him this question. And the question was like one of the deepest, most insightful questions about the industry that anybody could ask. And it was basically a dare. Like Bob was like, "I've just asked you a question based on my deep industry experience and knowledge, and I'm going to see how you react to this." And I still remember Richard was like, "Wow, I have no idea how to answer that question."
Just ran out of the room.
No, you didn't run out of the room. And so, but the benefit was that, Rich said, "Thanks for that question. I'm going to take that question away to my team, and I'm going to get back to you with an answer in a couple of days." And so I still remember Bob was like, looked at Rich and he's like, "Okay, I'm in. Who else is in?" And so he actually committed to invest on a non-answer. But what he was looking for was humility, and he was looking for that ability to sort of communicate what you know and what you don't know, and that you're able to learn quickly. And what I'll tell you is investors who support unicorn companies are always looking for that humility. If you go in and you can answer 10 out of 10 questions, they're not going to want to invest, because you're making it up somewhere along the way, for sure. Right? So I found that was really interesting. But it also leads me to sort of my next topic, which is on scaling. And just to give you guys a bit of a heads up, what we're going to do is we're going to use this next topic as a break point, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But on scaling, guys like Bob Senoff, Jeff Ventris, Ryan Holmes is an investor. When they're working with unicorn scale companies, they like to hear no as much or more as yes. How did you focus early by saying no to certain things, and maybe give some examples for how you created focus in order to actually create breakthrough growth?
Yeah, I think no, and prioritization was totally critical. I think a lot about scaling in terms of partnerships. I've just always felt that partnerships are a really great way to scale. You can open up a whole new channel. At Brightkit, very early on, Hootsuite was just this huge success, and it was 5 or 6 years ago, and we were one of the first companies to integrate. And so, thinking about how do you scale through these partnerships and integrations was really key, because we had a small customer base. Hootsuite had millions of customers, and so by having that integration, we were then able to scale. And now that I've been at Hootsuite, we've again focused. I've spent 4 years focusing on partnerships. And so if you look at Hootsuite as a large company, you've got much larger companies like an Adobe, who we've developed a really strong partnership. Adobe's got $120 billion market cap, and so you're then able to go and then take it to the next level, or to scale and partner with a Facebook or a Twitter who have millions of brands that use their tool. So I think for us, there's this notion of you can constantly chase rainbows, and there's always the next good idea. There's always a great next partner. But I think really, if you want to go deep and want to do something meaningful, you have to focus.
Yeah, and I actually like the connection there between focus, but also the ability to leverage partnerships to accelerate growth. Hootsuite very early on. And by the way, Ryan was the master of the mentor emails, keeping mentors and investors posted. And I still have the email when he sent, this is going back a few years ago, where he said, hey, I'm going down to Silicon Valley to meet with the folks at Twitter, back when Hootsuite was only integrated with Twitter. And he said, and I'm looking for an introduction into Facebook. And so to myself, and there was about 8 of us on the email thread, and we were all racing to see who would be the guy who would introduce Ryan to Facebook, right? That's because we're all type A, and that's what we wanted to do. And so, but the important part was that, he was laser focused on being cross-platform early and to the sacrifice of everything else. But he also leveraged partnerships, whether it was investors, mentors, or strategic partners like a Facebook. So I think it's a great example. What I'd love to do now is I'd love to see if you guys have some questions about scaling. Our last topic, just so you guys know, is on the acquisition front. So if there are no questions, we will continue on. But if there are questions, we'd love to take them. So if you have a loud voice and you just want to yell it out, go ahead. So the question for everybody is, how do you know which investors to focus on? And you gave a couple of data points. So you said based on values, based on vision, could be a few other criteria. So other criteria that we would look at would be industry focus, return alignment, which is both scale of return and time frame, right? So how long are you willing to wait before you exit? Maybe talk about some of your investor experience.
I think generally people who are willing to write checks is always a good thing. And then going from there, I loved having a really diverse group, and when I think about asks, a lot of the investors I had, you had some people that wrote a check and were like, okay, I'll call you in 10 years. Let me know how things go in 10 years. And then others who, like I had an investor who showed up to the office 3 or 4 times a week and would make cold calls for us. Like he was just so dedicated and passionate. And I think having a mix, you don't want all your investors in your office every day. But I thought about it in a couple ways. One was, how could someone help scale? So has someone gone through this experience of this early stage? A lot of people have gone through later stage that have capital that are willing to invest, but who has some experience at really early stage? And then the second piece that I thought a lot about was we wanted to go after companies and brands. That's how we wanted to acquire customers. So if I had 10 investors who knew 10 companies really intimately, that opened us up to 100 new customers. So I thought a lot about in terms of customer acquisition.
So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one, the first round at Hootsuite, that a lot of people probably remember from the press release, but it was about a $2 million round. Blumberg Ventures, Hearst Ventures were the 2 cornerstones, both venture capital firms, both U.S. Ryan put together the first sort of all U.S. round for a Canadian company at the time. It took him many months to do that, but he was laser focused on what Rich was just describing, which is people who understood brands and agencies and also knew how to scale a global business. Right, so there was a lot of alignment both on industry as well as the business model. So those are 2 key critical top 2 criteria for any of you thinking about looking for investors. Is you need to find people who have industry experience and business model experience, because they will help you to avoid all those rookie mistakes, and they will also be scale aligned. The other key pieces is that geographic focus. So geographic, both being with yourself, like somebody who's local that you can meet with, as Rich was describing with that one investor, as well as people who are geographically proximate to your customers. And then the other one is values aligned, easy to work with, return aligned. And so those come through reference checks. And so one thing I will highlight to you guys, if you want to be in the top 1-2% of entrepreneurs in the eyes of investors, do reference checks, ask for them. Because you're selling a piece of your company to this person like you're getting married, right? Until you IPO or you exit or you retire. And so the important part in that exercise is you need to know they're a fit, so reference check them. So just keep that in mind as you go through. Values alignment is more and more critical today because, you know, in the ebbs and flows of work and the ups and downs of revenue and profitability and everything else, you have to be aligned. So you really do want to reference check that.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
Please.
Maybe talk about recruitment and retaining people through the growth. How did you approach it so that your leadership wasn't burdened with constantly recruiting and backfilling people without the risk of diluting the quality or the value?
Yeah, that is a really great question. I think it's one of the biggest challenges. If you look at Hootsuite in the early days, and I talked to Ryan about this, he didn't lose anyone, I think, in the first 100 people, because I think it was everyone was on this same ship, on the same journey together. And then at some point, it's just natural. People move or do something else or start their own company. You start to lose people. And I think in the early days of losing people, it is, you know, it's a real hit because the culture is tied to individuals. You know, I think if we look at what we've done, you know, over the last few years, we've really focused on groups of individuals, you know, groups of performing managers, because you can't think about everyone. You need to think about a certain core. So if you've got really good high performing managers, you know that then you can foster that the right culture, and then those managers are also going to recruit the right types of individuals, because you just can't have the same amount of control at a 20-person startup as you do in a 1,000-person organization.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that I've seen work really well with organizations that have grown quickly and of significant scale in Vancouver, so people like Vision Critical, Hootsuite, more recently Bench, Unbounce, Clio, some organizations like that. What you'll often find is that the founders always talk about we and the organization. So it's always bigger than the person, right? So when you're recruiting, and you're bringing people into the team, and then when people are in the team and you're engaging, you have to be talking about the organization, what it stands for, and what your North Star is. Because if you're just talking, like if I'm talking to you about like, hey, you know, you're my new digital marketing director, that's awesome. Like, let's talk about how we're going to grow you. If it's just about you all the time, that's a recipe for churn, right? Because they'll get to a certain place and they'll be like, oh, I need to move on. You need to make it bigger than them. Because that's how you will get them to really stick in. And Ryan did a fantastic job of that early at Hootsuite, but you definitely see a lot of that at places like Unbounce today. Thinkific would be another outstanding example. Yeah.
Okay, so round of applause for our panelists.